Hello, 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 listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault Podcast. I am your host, Casey, and joining me today is a returning guest who I spoke with a while ago at the start of a project, which is now finished and is in the world and has been published and looks amazing. So I'm so excited to welcome back Lonnie. Hi, Lonnie.
Hello. How's it going?
It's going okay. It's cold and miserable here, middle of the day, but it's evening time where you are in Tokyo.
It is. I wish it were colder here. It's still summer. It's still going strong, unfortunately.
What the season's like in Japan? I mean, Japan's bigger, isn't it? So,
right. It depends, where you are, obviously. It's more of a north-south kind of situation. So if you go all the way down south, then it's quite tropical. And if you go all the way up north, then, it's a lot cooler and drier. But in Tokyo, it's pretty hot and humid in the summer. It definitely gets, on the colder side in the winter, but you might get snow a couple times. It doesn't get that cold, in my opinion. But winter's my favorite season, so, your mileage may vary.
Your bias is coming through.
Exactly.
So some people that are listening who have been long-time listeners of the show might recall our conversation from last time. But for any of those people that are joining us that are perhaps new to the Cult Vault podcast, would you like to please introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Well, my name is Lonnie, and I grew up Orthodox Jewish in New York, part of New York called Long Island, which is about an hour outside Manhattan. And, well, the town I grew up in was about an hour outside Manhattan. Long Island, as the name implies, is fairly long. So, you might actually be way out there or quite close to the city. But, I felt quite trapped in that community and lifestyle and managed to get myself out of there. I went off to college, moving from New York to Arizona. And then after that, I went even further to Japan and taught English for a little over a year before moving back to New York and then eventually Seattle. And then a couple of years ago, my partner and I moved here to Tokyo. So I'm back in Japan once again after a bit of a whirlwind journey. I was on the show before to talk about my experiences growing up Orthodox Jewish. And since then, my partner and I have been published. We created a biographical, for me, an autobiographical memoir graphic novel about my experiences growing up. And it's called Gaytheist, Coming Out of My Orthodox Childhood. And for anyone on video, it looks like this. And you can order it online. And hopefully next year, fingers crossed, an ebook version, a digital version should come out. So that should be a little bit more, quite a bit more accessible, in terms of just physical space. If you don't have a ton of room in your house, and I think the digital version might end up actually potentially looking even better than the paper version, because you don't have to deal with things like, do the colors print right on the paper stock and all that. You can get it was all drawn and illustrated digitally. It's meant to look like it was done in watercolor, but it's all digital, so you're going to get all the original intended colors and saturation and all that in the digital version. So yeah, hopefully looking forward to that. But that came out earlier this year in February, and it's been very exciting. So I think that's my story so far.
It's so beautifully illustrated. The panels are, as I mentioned before we hit the record button, the panels are soft, but every panel is striking on its own. And I just love going through each one here. I can just see here just the sample of on Amazon where the book is available for people to purchase, and where I will also copy the link from and put in the episode description. It's just so lovely to look at, and kind of different from other graphic novels, comics and manga that I've read as well. So it's like definitely a stylized, specific type of drawing that I guess is yours.
I had originally been working on this project for years and years just by myself. And in order to try to make that a little bit simpler and quicker, it was originally being drawn kind of in a monotone of reds. So not black and white, but not full color. And that whole process went through a lot of iterations, and I found an agent, and we pitched to a bunch of publishing companies, and everyone said no thanks. And I spent 3 years completely rewriting the script, like completely redoing it. And at some point, eventually, my partner, who is a much better illustrator and technical artist than I am, suggested we try collaborating. And I was very nervous about that, obviously, to give up any amount of control. But we did a little test page, just the first page of the prologue, and came out really, really, really great. So I was like, okay, well, let's try the next couple of pages. And the prologue's only 4 pages, so we finished that, and I was pretty much like, I mean, if the whole book could look like this, that would be amazing. It also helped shift some of the workload off of my shoulders. Yeah, eventually we ended up drawing the whole book together, 250 some odd pages of it. Technically, I think only 200 pages of comic pages, but the book itself, with all the in-betweens and the author's notes and yada yada, it's a little over 250. So, yeah, it's full color, and like I said, meant to look like watercolor, although it's not technically watercolor. And yeah, I think it came out pretty good. Very happy.
And I asked before we hit the record button, how satisfying it feels to hold that finished book in your hands.
Very crazy, very crazy. This is I had done comics before this. Obviously, I had done a Kickstarter back in, gosh, I don't know, 2015 or so, 2014, to publish a travelogue comic about a couple trips I took to Iceland, and that was just a much, much smaller project. I think in total that was about 120 pages, maybe. There's only about 50 or so like comic pages, and the rest were stories and illustrations, so watercolor illustrations for that one. But this is by far the largest project I've finished, and the first one that's been published by a publisher, not self-published, and printed through just my own work and stuff. So yeah, it's crazy. It's a big deal.
I imagine when you say that this is the biggest project that you've worked on and completed, that also might include the Iceland stories is still autobiographical, but with this particular story being a memoir of your childhood and your kind of coming of age and growing into adulthood, it holds a significant difference to kind of relaying anecdotes about time spent in different countries.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even since I was younger, I felt like my story about growing up in that community, and the extra complicated factor is growing up Orthodox Jewish as a gay man makes it harder than I think for straight people, probably. There's that extra wrinkle. I felt like I wanted to tell people about this, tell people what it's like in that situation. And so I kind of knew I wanted to create some kind of story in some form for a very long time. But I knew I didn't want to do it before I had enough experience making comics. When I decided it would be cool to do a graphic novel of it, I knew I didn't want it to be like my first big comic project, right? I needed to get practice in and all that. So yeah, in one sense, it was a long time coming. And it also took a long time to do. Like the actual work on it took a long time as well. So yeah, it's basically what I was already saying. Just going to trail off there. But actually, originally, this version of the script was almost twice as long. It was about 350 pages of comic script. And when we published this version, that was just too long for, a first time published. I'm with a pretty small publisher as well, so like it just would have been too expensive a project. So we cut it down from that 350 page script to 200 pages, which didn't mean like cutting it up a bunch. It mostly meant chopping off the last, little bit less than half of it. So whereas the story originally went through after finishing college, this one, or university, this one ends. I don't know. I don't think it's any huge spoiler, but it ends right before my senior year of high school, my final year of high school. So there are a lot of people who post reviews who say very nice things, like, I loved it, it was great, blah, blah, blah. Not blah, blah, blah. I appreciate it. But then inevitably, it just sort of ends.
Yeah, what happens
But
next?
there has to be more. Like, why did it end there? And we did do work to turn that chapter that it ends after into the final chapter of a book rather than just a chapter in the middle of a book. So it did go through changes, and a couple extra pages were added here and there in the book to offer more context and, more information that wouldn't have been in there, that wasn't in there originally. But, even with all that, like, I did have a conception of the full arc of the story, and I think that this book does work by itself where it ends. But everyone who posts that there should be more, why isn't there more, that wasn't enough. I agree. I wanted there to be more, and hopefully I'll get a chance to do a follow-up book. Nothing.
That was going to be my next question.
No guarantees.
Every review plants that seed of like, oh, maybe I could do a sequel.
Listen, it's definitely the intention. It's not like there are any contracts signed. I have that those additional chapters of script that I had already written, and those would need to be edited and refined to turn that first chapter more into the first chapter of a book rather than a chapter in the middle of a book. And that would need to go through some work to make that script into what it should be. And then of course there's all the drawing. So yeah,
just that little bit that also comes with putting a graphic novel together.
Yeah, so definitely hoping to do that at some point, but no particular timeline available to share.
Right. And when you talk about people leaving reviews of your work, do you have people reach out and talk about how your experiences resonate with them on a personal level?
Yeah, some people do, and it's really meaningful to be able to read those things. And sometimes it's a very short, just like, oof, right in the feels, or wow, that really reminded me of all my traumatic experiences, or whatever. But sometimes people actually unpack their feelings a bit more and write some heartfelt messages, which are really, really nice. I've only been able to go to a comic convention and do like some signing and selling once, which was at TCAF in Toronto, I think it's Toronto Comic Arts Festival, which was in May, because it is a very, very long trip from Japan back to the US. So I was there for just a little bit of time at the end of April, beginning of May, earlier this year. And I was able to meet up with my publisher at this comic convention, and some people came over who were already familiar with the book and said some very nice things, which was great. I really enjoyed that. You had mentioned that there's the sample on Amazon. That's true. I'm not sure how long that sample is, but there's the prologue and the first two chapters, I think, are on lonniecomics.com, which is just like my website that promoting the book. So if you go there, you can see some more sample too. And there are links to various different websites, at least in the US, where you can buy it if you want. I know it's also on Amazon Japan and Kinokuniya, which is a bookstore that has a ton of locations in Japan, as well as locations in other countries too. But yeah, ask for it at your local bookstore, or not bookstore. Well, yes, bookstore, but your local library is what I meant to say. If they don't have it, they could always order a copy, and then, more people can read it for free, and that's always nice. So
it's a very nice, crisp and clean website as well. I think you can definitely tell that this has probably been put together by you as somebody that is adept at using
I hired designers. To make the website. Yeah, but I mean, we worked together on it. But I mean, I did not do most of the work on that. I paid professionals to do that.
It's very crisp and clean. I need to take some notes of how to have a neat website. So I'll pop links to everything we talk about in the episode description today, including lonniecomics.com. And I recall the last time we spoke, some of your work had been published in kind of like a combined.
It was an anthology.
That's right, an anthology.
Yeah. It's called American Cult. It's published by Silver Sprocket, which is a really cool publisher here in the U.S. And it was an anthology of some biographical, some autobiographical stories about various cults that have existed or do still exist in America. It really what's the phrase I'm looking for? It runs the gamut. It really runs the gamut of different sorts of cults. And I wrote a little 14-page kind of comic essay arguing that Orthodox Judaism fits all the criteria, the bite criteria and all that for what makes a cult a cult. That's another comic of mine you can read either in there or on my page on itch.io. You can download it for free or pay what you want. And my Iceland comic is also up there. So yeah, that comic is just called Orthodox Judaism is a Cult. Very does what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
And it's really just kind of my pitch for why I think it counts.
We don't have many former Jewish individuals come and speak on the podcast about growing up in Judaism of any type. So would you be able to remind myself and the listeners what the main types of Judaism are that you would class as the main types of Judaism? I think if I was to kind of look at Christianity as the umbrella, you'd be able to kind of pinpoint major factions of Christianity under that term. So I'm not well versed or aware of the ins and outs of Judaism. So I'd like to ask you to help me with that.
Of course.
If that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. So there are definitely a bunch of different sects of Judaism. I grew up what was referred to, at least internally, as modern Orthodox. So Orthodox typically refers to sects of Judaism that keep quite complex rules of kosher. That's what you're allowed to and not allowed to eat. And that's not just particular types of animals, for example, but that's also the ways in which they need to be slaughtered in order to keep them kosher. So if you don't do that the right way, even if it's considered a kosher animal, then it's not actually kosher meat, the way it needs to be prepared or cooked. And it's very complicated. But that complex set of rules, as well as the rules of Sabbath, which for Jews goes from sundown or just before sundown Friday night until nighttime Saturday night. So it's about a 25 or so hour period where you can't do a whole mess of things. You can't use electricity, you can't cook, you can't light a fire or extinguish a fire, you can't write, you can't erase, you can't draw, you can't buy or sell things, you can't play music, you can't ride a bike, you can't you can eat, you can sleep, you can pray, you can talk, you can play board games as well, as long as there's no writing involved or no electronic pieces. So it's every week is like that. And those are like two big categories of rules that are, I think, unique to Orthodox sects of Judaism. So going further than, like, more strict than how I grew up would go from modern Orthodox to ultra-Orthodox. And there's a bunch of different flavors within ultra-Orthodox as well that might follow different particular styles of ritual or complexities or rules, or, they might follow a particular rabbi who they may or might not believe was the Messiah, potentially. And so it's like, I had family, relatives who were ultra-Orthodox as well. They usually dress much more conservatively Like men just wear black pants and white button-down shirts and maybe like a suit jacket sometimes, or like a black hat. And that's basically the uniform that they wear every day, all the time. Whereas we wore, if I wasn't at school where I had a little bit of a dress code, like button collared shirts and like non-denim, kind of non-sneakers kind of stuff. If it was like the weekend, I was probably wearing shorts and t-shirts or jeans or what have you. But I always had to be wearing a yarmulke on my head. And I always had to be wearing tzitzis, which is a garment that is kind of like a little poncho in that it is four-cornered and there's like a hole for your head. And in each of the four corners, there's a somewhat complex kind of tassel of strings that are tied in a particular way. And so Jewish men wear that typically underneath their shirts or, under their clothes and tucked into their pants. So it's usually not visible, although if you're ultra-Orthodox, probably the fringes themselves are sticking out. You've probably seen that. But if you go less strict from modern Orthodox, you go to conservative, which really, the complexities and amount and types of rules that are kept vary quite a bit from family to family. Some folks might have separate dishes for meat and dairy foods, which Orthodox people do. Other conservative Jews might not. Some might drive to the synagogue on Sabbath, on Shabbos, and others might not and walk instead and don't use their cars. So there's quite a range, but then further lax or, less strict from conservative Judaism is Reform Judaism, which I don't have a super detailed familiarity with these because I didn't grow up this way. But Reform, my impression is that it's not unusual for people to consider themselves Reform Jews and atheist. So it's really much more of a solidly focused on culture and tradition, the holidays and the foods and the songs, and not the complicated food rules and Sabbath rules and holiday rules and things like that. But a lot of people still keep kind of big touch points like not eating any pork products just because it feels like I'm Jewish, so that is something I don't do. But like that's kind of the extent of how they think about it. And there's nothing really further than that potentially. If you don't believe in God anymore, or if you ever did, but you still consider yourself Jewish, it's like, what does that mean to you? And then it really becomes unique to your local community or your family or yourself. And then there's also people who consider themselves cultural Jews and they don't identify as Reform or conservative or anything. And they're basically like, I'm Jewish, my family's Jewish, my ancestors were Jewish, probably I came to whatever country I live in, or not came to, but like, maybe my grandparents came here escaping the Holocaust. And so it's important to maintain my Jewish identity. But, that might end up really just being more a sense of how you interact with your family. And, you might practice the holidays or celebrate the holidays in some personal way, but like none of it is necessarily religious at that point. It's
right.
Really just cultural.
Right.
So yeah, it's a very wide
right. A whole spectrum of different it's like levels of strictness is how I would describe it, which of course
it's part of it. It's definitely a big part of it. Yeah.
And that's something that I have always wondered when it comes to Jewish identity, because it's my understanding that the Jewish identity is an ethnicity, a nation, a culture, a race, and a religion. So I mentioned at the start that we don't have a lot of former Jewish individuals come and speak on the show, but then that raises the question on whether you can actually be former Jewish. And even if you step away from the religious aspect of Judaism, does that still mean that you hold a Jewish identity?
Yeah, this really depends on who you ask. People I grew up with don't think you can give up your Judaism because they think if you had a Jewish mother, if you were born to a Jewish mother, you're Jewish. Your father doesn't matter. So, even if your father isn't Jewish, that has nothing to do with it. There's no such thing as half-Jews to them. So my mother was Jewish, my father was also Jewish, but that doesn't matter. My mother is Jewish, therefore I'm Jewish. Even if I stop practicing, even if I don't identify as Jewish, even if I tell everyone I'm not Jewish, they're like, that has nothing to do with you, actually. It's almost as if it's genetic, right? It's a bloodline kind of thing. However, at the same time, you can convert to Judaism, and it's complicated, and it's difficult, and the official policy, like in the religion, is that if somebody comes to a rabbi and says, I want to convert to Judaism, they have to be turned away. I forget if it's I think it's 2 times, and then if they come back a 3rd time, it's like, okay, if you're really that serious, then here we can start learning more about what that really means, what that would really involve, because religious Jews, at least Orthodox Jews, believe that there's 613 religious laws and rules and things from God for Jews, and that's all sorts of stuff. But for non-Jews, there's just 7, and the 7 laws for non-Jews have to do with don't steal, don't kill, set up courts and judges in your nations, very biblical kind of things like that. Some of them are more, on the individual level, and some of them are more on a national level. So from that perspective, it's well, as long as you as a non-Jewish person keep these 7 pretty big, relatively speaking, probably easy to follow rules, then, you're fine. And you don't have all these extra responsibilities because you are not the chosen nation. You are not the chosen people. You don't have all these extra responsibilities because you're so special, because you're not so special. I should say. Yeah. And so therefore, why would you opt in to all these extra rules that somebody born into it cannot opt out of? Is part of the thinking. It's you don't want to deal with this. Why do you want to deal with this? This has nothing to do with you. You don't need to worry about this. That's really the perspective there. So, but be that as it may, keeping that in mind, you can convert to Judaism, and then you will forever be responsible, spiritually speaking, in their eyes, for all these rules. And if you give birth to someone, that person would be then responsible, and so on. And so, there are many different ethnicities within the group of people who identify as Jewish and who practice forms of Jewish religion. There are Ethiopian Jews. There are, Jews obviously from Israel or Palestine or, elsewhere in the Middle East. There are Jews who have lived in Europe for many generations. You can have a very white-looking Jewish person and a black Jewish person, and there are Chinese Jewish people, and, all over. So is Judaism an ethnicity? Lots of people would say yes. It's complicated, as you can tell. It's definitely a religion, and there's definitely Jewish culture, and Jewish culture can also vary by the particular country you're talking about, too. So it's definitely not a monolith by any means. We can probably leave that there. I mean, unless you have any particular faults.
Well, kind of reassured from your explanation there that it's not just me misunderstanding that there are all these different types of Jewish identity, because yes. I just thought that maybe as somebody that has not practiced faith or religion, that maybe I'm just missing key pieces of information and it's me. But I'm kind of relieved to know that it is a complicated and confusing matter. My brain kind of feels ease a little bit more.
Good. There's also, roughly speaking, for the planet, very, very few Jewish people. The number, the population, or the percentage of population is extremely low. And so, you take that very, very tiny percentage of people, and then you start subdividing that into all these different unique versions of the identity or identities. And they're all a little bit or a lot different from each other. And, even within Orthodox Judaism, there is a big emphasis on tradition, just like that song from that musical, which practically speaking means that if you are following rules that you were taught by your father or by their rabbi or, your family's rabbi or your rabbi's rabbi, going back whenever that tradition may have formed, that becomes religious law for you. And to the extent that, for example, different families wait different amounts of time, different numbers of hours after eating meat before they feel that they are allowed to eat dairy. So, in my family, I think it was something like 5 hours or so, that, if I had a hamburger and I wanted to have ice cream, I'd have to wait 5 hours after having that hamburger before I was allowed to eat.
I remember us talking about this because then I said, so you can't have a cheeseburger because you can't have them together.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And so, but there are families or traditions where you only wait an hour, actually, which is a very, very big difference. Another big difference is, for example, on Passover, which is a holiday where you can't have any leavened bread, any bread itself, other than matzah, which is unleavened. You can't have pasta, you can't have pizza, you can't have cereal, you can't have, I mean, at this day and age, like, it's evolved to the point where you can't have many, many, many different types of grains, kind of, I think, if I recall correctly, just because in case other grains may have gotten mixed in, or during the cooking process, maybe it got wet, maybe it kind of got leavened a little bit, this, that, the other. But so Ashkenazi Jews, European white Jews, I think is generally what that refers to, they don't eat rice on Passover, just in case something may have gotten mixed in, extra careful. However, Sephardic Jews who are, I want to say more Middle Eastern, I don't really know the particulars on this, so I'm sorry if I'm messing it up. But basically, when I was growing up, the Sephardic folks in my community would eat rice, but they had to, before Passover, go through and inspect each individual grain of rice to make sure there's no other, like, wheat or anything else mixed in there. But then they could cook rice and they could eat it on Passover. But even though, let's say these two families, an Ashkenazi family and a Sephardic family, would consider themselves and each other Orthodox Jewish, they both agreed that rice is kosher on Passover for the Sephardic family, but not for the Ashkenazi family. So if you went over to a Sephardic family's house for a Passover meal, and they had rice there, and you're Ashkenazi, you would not be allowed to eat that because it is not kosher for you. And it's like, but that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, I think that doesn't make any sense. It should just be one set of rules, one religion, right? Like from God or something. But no, there's a lot of discretion given historically to tradition and rabbis and the decisions that they make in interpreting laws and creating what they call like fences around the laws. So they'll say, okay, this is technically what it says in the Bible that you can't do. We're going to actually say you can't even do this, because if you come to do that, you might still not do the biblical commandment. So we're protecting that with this extra law. And over the hundreds and thousands of years, fences have been built around fences, around fences, around fences. So now the religion has become, at least if you're Orthodox, filled with incredibly strict rules that are miles away from the actual biblical commandment due to interpretations and extra protections.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I remember being blown away by the intricacies of some of these fences that you were describing the last time we spoke. But what really stuck with me were the loopholes that you talked about as well. I think it was our conversation where you mentioned that you can't light a fire. So some people would they'd turn their stove on before Passover and just leave it turned right down, or before Sabbath, sorry. And just leave it like...
Both.
Leave it like on, and then make sure it wouldn't, because you can't extinguish a flame, so make sure it wouldn't.
That's right.
Turn off halfway through.
Yeah. Well, because you're not allowed to cook on Sabbath, right? Because that's the weekly one on Saturdays. But if you have food that's already been cooked before Sabbath, right, and you just want to warm it up, and so you leave your stove on, your stovetop, that puts a barrier between the actual fire and what you're heating up. So it's more of an indirect heat. So usually in that community, you'd have like kind of a metal sheet that goes on top of the stove. And I believe it's called a blech in Yiddish. I don't know exactly why or what that means in particular, but then you put the pot on top of that. So there's a sheet of metal in between the actual fire and the pot. And you can just put it on there, and it's, it'll warm back up. But because it's already been cooked, it's not considered cooking, right? Because like some fundamental aspect of the chemistry of the food and the ingredients have changed in the original cooking process, and now this isn't considered cooking. Whereas on a holiday like Passover, you can technically cook, but you can't build or extinguish a fire. So if you leave the stove on, you can cook, and you can actually turn it higher and lower on a holiday, not Sabbath, and you can cook. There's just an endless list of things like that. It's really very complicated.
I was blown way. The fences and the loopholes were kind of like, in my mind, I was like, but that's kind of contradictory, because the rules are, the rules have rules, and then those rules have rules, but also we've found ways to get around those rules by, I think you mentioned having some kind of line within the community where people would like ferry things backwards and forwards to one another because you're not allowed to visit or travel.
I can clear that up. One of the categories of quote unquote work, which is not a great translation of the biblical Hebrew, but is what they call it. There's 39 categories of quote unquote work that you can't do on the Sabbath. And that's based on when the Jews left Egypt and were traveling in the desert. They had this kind of like traveling temple where they would bring sacrifices called the Mishkan. And so they would set that all up and they would break it down and they would move and set it back up again. Biblically speaking, there were 39 categories of work that went into the setting up and operation and breaking down of the Mishkan. And so that's not just like construction and fires, but it's also like all the steps of like planting and sowing and winnowing and harvesting and all that, and dyeing cloth and like all sorts of things. But anyway, one of the activities you can't do is carrying things on your person outside of your abode, outside of your house. And so that's like, I have a purse, I have a bag, I'm, carrying whatever. You can't do that. So the workaround is they have these poles with strings like going around a section of community. And basically the idea is that like religiously, this community is one property now. It's one space. So you can carry stuff around inside your home. So it's like now, this allows you to carry stuff around outside as long as it's within this area. Yeah. I forget the name for this thing. It has a name. I can't recall at the moment because it's been like
I find it fascinating.
But yeah, that is one of the loopholes. Yeah. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to like carry your keys with you in your pocket when you like leave the house.
It's some of the things that we talked about have just stayed with me all the way to this point today. And I was thinking about the full title of your book, Gaytheist, Coming Out of My Orthodox Childhood. It's very carefully worded. It's clearly a play on words.
Yes.
Because coming out as gay. Also, you say coming out of my Orthodox childhood. So you're not really telling the reader there what you think about your Jewish identity. You're not talking about leaving that identity behind, and you're not talking about what Judaism means to you in adulthood. You're just kind of talking about the childhood specifically. Yeah. So I don't know if that's a question that you'd feel comfortable answering.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I'm completely atheist. I don't identify, like, here's the thing. There's parts of how I grew up in an incredibly insular community. Like, until I went to college, I didn't have any friends or family whatsoever that wasn't Orthodox Jewish, right? Like, even Jewish, but not Orthodox. It's very, very insular. So, there are ways of how I talk, maybe my word choices or like Yiddishisms, or, I feel like I've kind of tried not to maintain like the dialect, kind of the accent that maybe you might associate with someone from like the part of Long Island where I'm from. But there's definitely aspects of that that's just baked in, that's just going to be like part of me forever. The way I relate to the world and things like that, right? So like that's just who I am. And part of that has to do with being in a Jewish culture and community for 18 years. But I would say I've really abandoned pretty much everything about that I can, either intentionally or unintentionally. Yeah, it's I'm not religious or spiritual in any way. I don't believe in anything supernatural. I'm not agnostic. I'm just atheist. So that's, part of the title, obviously, Gaytheist. Now, like I mentioned earlier, because the story was cut down significantly, it doesn't actually get all the way to the point in my life, which was in university, when I made that final jump from agnostic to atheist. Because over time, starting sometime in high school, I went from actually believing in Orthodox Judaism to being like, well, I think some kind of Judaism is probably right, but I don't know if it's Orthodox or maybe some kind of conservative Judaism, to being more of kind of a generic deist, like I still believe in God, but I don't know if Judaism is like the one true religion, to being agnostic, like, well, you can't disprove that God exists, until eventually I very comfortably settled on atheism. That whole journey, unfortunately, is not in this book, but will hopefully be covered in a follow-up at some point, fingers crossed. But yeah, I think I kind of got away from the question, but
no, absolutely not. That was great. It was a question about your particular Jewish identity, and I think
I'd say I identify as someone who is raised Jewish, but I don't particularly like. I'm Jewish in the sense, in like the ethnic sense that you would like if you do a DNA test and like there's Ashkenazi Jewish as one of the sort of genomic categories, so that would show up for me, right? Because like that's just the stock I come from, but I don't identify like culturally or religiously at all as Jewish.
And you mentioned at the start of our conversation that your book came off of the back of your experiences feeling trapped in your childhood. And through our conversation, you've talked about the strict religious rules that you had to live by every day. You've talked about growing up gay in a religious space that probably only recognizes heteronormality. And you've also talked about growing up in an insular community. So any number of those things would lead to, I imagine, somebody feeling trapped in their environment. Are there any specific things that you draw on when you think about that time in your life where one thing is made you feel more trapped than others?
Yeah. Well, I mean, from a fairly young age, I really, really wanted to have a boyfriend, and I couldn't, even talk about that with anyone, let alone actively search for one. Of course, I went to an Orthodox Jewish school system, all boys religious school with prayer multiple times a day, and the whole morning until lunchtime were Jewish classes. Like the class subject itself, they had homework and tests and everything, but the Bible and prophets and Jewish philosophy and all that. It was only after lunch that we would actually get around to social studies and math and science and things, all the state required stuff. So the particular things that made me feel trapped. What was really crazy to me was that, so in that environment, in that school system, there was a huge emphasis on the survivor mentality, I'd say, of like modern Orthodox Judaism and its culture and its followers, constantly talking about the Holocaust. Like this was not a once a year for Holocaust Remembrance Day kind of thing. This was like pretty much every day, all the time. We were hearing stories and like the emphasis about, that could happen again if we're not good enough Jews, and like a lot of self-victimization and a lot of like really conspiratorial like thinking, like everyone hates the Jews, never forget it, you can never leave the community because everyone outside the community will hate you because you're Jewish. And they don't know why. It's not like they're inherently bad people. It's just the way God created the world, which, it doesn't make any sense. They're just programmed that way. So, it's not safe for anyone outside of our insular community. It's like really, really crazy thinking. And so one of what I was trying to lead myself up to, but I got distracted again, was one of the craziest thing is this talk about how everyone outside the community has it out for you. And at the same time, it was very clear to me that as a gay person, I was in a category that they felt that way about. I was hiding within my community the same way they told me stories every day about hiding, in people's attics in Europe, in Poland, in Germany, and whatever during the Holocaust. Like, obviously not the same extent. I am not in any way trying to actually one-to-one liken my experience growing up in an Orthodox Jewish community as a gay person to being a Jewish person during World War II in Europe. But the sort of mentality, the vibes, the way they were talking about it, of like, everyone hates you and they don't know why. I'm like, yeah, I know. You're talking about yourselves. You're telling on yourselves. You're talking about how you feel about me and how it sounds every day to hear, all the slurs being thrown around, and how, people would just make jokes about gay people all the time, and like how the very concept was disgusting to everyone. I mean, this isn't unique to Orthodox Jewish or like Jewish community. This is a very common, or at least at the time and place I was growing up and in America, very, very common situation across the board, I'm sure, in all sorts of communities for all sorts of people, not particularly unique to me, but like there was never going to be a gay straight alliance club at my school, for example. And, I couldn't, I didn't feel like I could safely come out. Obviously, eventually I did. But yeah, that particular contrast between, feeling like, if I existed at any point in the past in an Orthodox Jewish community as a gay person, I would have been in even more danger than I was when I did grow up, which is significantly less, because it was, I was born in 1986, so it was, the 90s, the 2000s, relatively modern times. But like, yeah, I feel there's also a lot of emphasis on responsibility to your ancestors and the people who came before you, who survived in order to make it possible for you to be here, and to respect everything they believed in by following the same things, the same, beliefs, the same cultural tenets and rituals and everything. But yeah, like I was saying, for me, the way I felt was, if I had existed in any other time, I wouldn't have maybe survived, or who knows what. So like, no, I feel no particular allegiance, or
right.
I don't feel like I owe them anything.
Yeah, it's so strange to have that kind of juxtaposition of being told every day about persecution that awaits if you leave, but also understanding that same persecution in the place that you're told is the only place you can be safe is the place that inherently makes it
kind of
unsafe.
like a cult, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. It's definitely difficult to think about the amount of people in those situations that didn't necessarily take the same route that you did, and perhaps ended up in marriages with children when actually they are attracted to the same sex.
Yep, that is a very common situation of gay folks still getting married and having kids and everything, because they feel that is their religious responsibility.
Just the thought of living an entire lifetime without being honest to yourself and everyone else, but also not feeling like you can do that is horrible. That's a horrible thought.
It is. There's a documentary that came out, I think it was when I was in high school. It's called Trembling Before God, and I don't think there's anywhere you can buy it at this point, but you can probably find like a low quality recording on YouTube or something. And it's a documentary specifically about queer Jews struggling to what's the word I'm looking for? Not match, but like integrate, or figure out the issues between their queer identity and their Jewish identity, and their religiosity or observance of more Orthodox Judaism. And it's not a positive or like happy documentary necessarily. It's very interesting. It's also pretty old at this point, but there's been some various documentaries and stories and books and stuff along those lines.
When you were kind of putting out samples of your book, and then once your book had finished and was published, Did you receive any professional or personal grievances? Sort of the professional side of it being more about like, you know, trying to get work out in the world and trying to get published and the difficulties that come with being an artist in this day and age. And then the personal grievances more towards family and friends or people that do identify as Jewish not agreeing with you putting this work into the world.
I don't think I've received any professional grievances of any kind. I went no contact with my parents in 2016, so I can't imagine that they're not aware of the book. But who knows? I don't know. Maybe they have no idea. They must be. I would bet that they must be aware of it, that they must have read it out of at least, you know, morbid curiosity. But I haven't heard anything about if they've read it, what they do or don't think about it. I'd be curious to some extent, but I mean, I feel like I can mostly figure it out what they might think. I only really have like one maintained friendship with someone who's still religious, who I grew up with, who I went to high school with, and he said really nice things about it. He really liked it, and he said actually that. At one point, it was just like out on his coffee table or whatever, and his older sister was over. So this must have been, you know, just earlier this year. And I guess she's pretty homophobic, or was, or is, I don't know. But she ended up reading it because it was there and was like, wow, this is the first, like, I've always just hated gay people, and I never really knew why. I never really thought about it. But wow, this is the first time I really kind of started to second guess or actually think about, like, what? Why do I hate gay people? I'm curious. And it's like, okay, congratulations. Wow, that's amazing. What a breakthrough. And mazel tov, everybody claps for you. But like, so yeah, you know, I don't know. If that's any indication, I think that there are probably Orthodox people who may have read it and actually not hated it, and may have even thought of, you know, had some kind of positive takeaway from it. And that would be great. There's definitely some Goodreads reviews from people who are like, who may or may not have even read it, but are just like very much like, oh, this is anti-God, and this is anti-Jewish, this is anti-Semitic, and this is whatever. And it's like, you know, okay, that was bound to happen, like whatever. But mostly people seem to like it, although some people think it, you know, it wasn't long enough, or it didn't go deep enough, or they wanted to learn more about Judaism from it. I tried as hard as I could to portray, or to show everything that I was going through and what I had to deal with and how it felt for me, without putting too much just explicit like judgment right there on the page about like, and I think this is all crazy and bad and wrong, and it's absolutely child abuse to force someone to grow up like this. And like, those are all things that I do believe, but I didn't want it to I didn't want to distract from like the story itself. The story itself was about my experiences and like what I went through and how I experienced it. And so I tried to really just show the kinds of rules that I was dealing with every day, the kinds of rituals I needed to do all the time, constantly. And, you know, it's a classic piece of writing advice: show, don't tell. You know, don't like, just show people what it's like, and then let them just take away whatever they're going to take away from that. Whatever message they get is, you know, however they feel about the situation as it is. And I think I did a pretty good job, if I do say so myself, of showing and not telling as much as possible. And, you know, a lot of people have written reviews who are like, wow, I learned a lot about Orthodox Judaism, and I had no idea it involved all these different things. And, you know, that seems really difficult. And, you know, it was. So, yeah, that was really my goal there. And I've definitely heard from Orthodox Jewish people who felt like they were surprised, at least I've been told, that they were surprised at how fairly I portrayed it. Because it's the kind of thing where two different people will look at the same picture and get a very, very different impression of it. And so someone who believes in all that, you know, reads it and is like, yeah, no, this is what it's like, and I think that's great. And clearly it was not something that you've like enjoyed or vibed with, or, you know, it was clearly difficult for you, and so on. But like, I see this and I say like, yeah, no, that's accurate. So that's what I was going for. So hopefully I achieved that to some extent.
Yeah, I absolutely. And I do believe that if you were to keep you as the main character, if you were to keep the main character's storyline the same, but take out the specific elements of Judaism and replace them with any type of high demand religious group, I imagine that the story would still play out very similar to the experiences that some people feel in other restrictive religious groups and cults, where sexuality is one of the things that is controlled above most other things. You know, we could talk about food, drink, clothing, but sexuality, reproductive coercion, and all of the things that come with controlling and really stripping away a person's autonomy above everything else. I hear so often, and I imagine you do too, the stories of people who grow up being told that they shouldn't exist. The kind of right to existence is told explicitly to people from the LGBT community in various different religious groups. I can't begin to imagine how that must feel, but I get a sense of that through reading your work, and I imagine it must be very validating for other people to read it and understand that perhaps they're not alone. But also for people like myself, I'd like to think I'm an ally to the LGBT community. I can still read that book and get a sense of the religion itself, and also the difficulties of growing up in such a restrictive and homophobic and difficult environment. And you're in Japan now, and you're living a completely different life to the one that you grew up in. Do you ever see anybody in traditional Jewish attire and you're kind of taken back to your childhood? Or you mentioned that there's so few Jewish people in the world today that maybe in Japan you don't see too much of a Jewish presence.
It's pretty rare, but I mean, it's probably mostly tourists who I happen by. I know that there are a couple synagogues or, Chabad houses. I think Chabad is an organization that is associated with a particular ultra-Orthodox Jewish sect, and their main thing is having these places, usually on college campuses or like near them, where Jews can go to have a kosher meal, to attend prayer services on the Sabbath, things like that. And so some of them are in very remote places. I think I haven't checked. I found out when I moved here the first time, like in 2007. So who knows if they're still around, but at least at that point, I think there was one in Tokyo and one in Kyoto. I see a yarmulke around every once in a blue moon. Not very often at all. When I do see one, it's just like, I don't know. It's a little bit like seeing a ghost. It's like, whoa, I wasn't expecting to see one of those here. It's not like I'm not constantly thinking about my childhood and how I grew up and everything like that. That was a big thing, and I will probably never be over it. So, I still have plenty of unpleasant dreams associated with being there. Yeah, it was a lot more when I lived in New York, because the Jewish population there is very, very, relatively speaking, probably the highest outside of Israel. Yeah, I mean, you'd see folks around a lot. And like, sometimes I would see people I recognized from having grown up. Like, he ran the summer camp I went to. Like, we are in the same elevator in the office building that I work in for some reason. I guess we both have companies in this building. Like, he doesn't recognize me. I look nothing like what I did when I was 11 or whatever, and also I'm not wearing a yarmulke, and also whatever. So, that happened a lot more in New York. But after I moved to Seattle, where I lived for, 7 or so years before moving to Japan, it happened much, much less, although there's a little bit of a Jewish community in Seattle. So, every once in a while I would see a yarmulke or two here and there. But, yeah, I don't know. When I see one, it's weird. It's just a little weird. It's not like, not like I freak out or anything. It's just surprising and like, easy to spot for me.
Well, you've mentioned that you are going to hopefully work on the sequel to Gaytheist at some point, which will talk more about your time after high school and into adulthood. Do you have any other creative projects that you're working on, or is it all taken up by your job as a creative in Japan?
Well, I have a full-time job, so, that obviously takes up a lot of time. And currently, so we've been here for a couple of years, and apartment leases are typically a couple of years, at least in Tokyo. So we are currently working on moving within Tokyo, and that is taking up a lot of attention and time and effort and stress. So I don't know when I'll be able to actually think about really working on that. Very TBD. I've got more than enough other stuff going on for now. Hopefully, if life calms down a little bit.
Life is chaos again. I say it all the time. People are like, I'm so sorry that I haven't replied to your email. And I say, just don't worry. Life is chaos. And equally, I am so bad at replying to emails sometimes because life just happens, and it's fast and it's non-stop.
It's very true.
So I will put links to Gaytheist, Coming Out of My Orthodox Childhood, into the episode description. I'll also put links to American Cult, which is the graphic history of religious cults in America from the colonial era to today, which Lonnie is featured in. And I will also put a link to lonniecomics.com in the episode description so that we can keep an eye on Lonnie's upcoming projects as well. And just find a compiled list of places where we can buy Lonnie's things from.
Yes, ask at your local shop. Much better than Amazon if you can swing it, although I understand Amazon is obviously the best deal in town. Or ask for it at your local library. And if they don't have a copy, maybe you can request one, and maybe they'll order one.
So I will also let the listeners know when there is an ebook available as well.
Great. Yeah, hopefully sometime next year.
We'll keep our eyes peeled. And if you do manage to write a sequel, I hope you'll come and sit down and chat with us for a third time.
So. Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much, Lonnie. It's a pleasure to sit down and chat with you now that you have finished the book and published it, and it's out in the world, available for everybody to purchase and go and have a read. And if any of the listeners do grab a hold of Gaytheist, please do get in touch with me so we can have a lengthy discussion about your thoughts on the book, and then maybe feed them back to Lonnie as well.
I would love that. That sounds great.
Well, thank you so much, Lonnie. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll speak to you soon.
Okay, sounds good.